Stop this meeting right now. Harlan Voss's voice cut through the old Mercy Cross Chapel. 50 townspeople turned. File boxes lined the pulpit. Ethan Walker, a broke veteran, stood beside a German shepherd that hadn't moved all morning. "Those papers are stolen," Harlan said. Ethan's hand rested on Atlas's head. "No," he answered. "They were buried." The dog stepped forward, not barking, just staring at the man who suddenly looked afraid of cardboard boxes. Then Mara opened the first file. The whole room went silent. But to understand why, you need to know what Atlas heard beneath a $20 swamp cabin. Ethan Walker was 42 years old, $3.8 million in debt, and standing ankle-deep in Louisiana mud when he realized a man could lose everything and still be expected to keep breathing. The rain had not started yet, but the swamp was already wet with the kind of dampness that seemed to rise from the earth itself, crawling into his boots, his sleeves, the old scar beneath his collarbone, the place his memory liked to hide. Behind him, 2 miles back on a washed-out levee road, sat his dying Ford pickup with a cracked passenger window, a half-empty gas tank, and a duffel bag containing nearly everything he still owned. Beside him stood Atlas, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a dark sable coat, a silvering muzzle, and eyes that had watched storms, sirens, ruined houses, and men pretending not to cry. Atlas did not pull at the leash. He did not whine. He simply stood there, steady as a sentry, looking at the crooked shack in front of them as if the place had called his name long before Ethan ever saw it. The listing had called it Lot 19B, Blackwater Bend, tax delinquent since 1998, structure present, access limited, flood risk severe. The county auction site had shown one blurry photograph: trees, moss, and what might have been a roof if a person was generous. Starting bid $20. Nobody wanted it. Nobody except Ethan, who had exactly $90 left, and a life so thoroughly collapsed that a rotting swamp cabin felt less like a bad decision than a final address. 3 years earlier, he had owned Walker & Vale Restoration, a small but respected storm repair company out of Gulfport, Mississippi. He had worn clean work shirts with his name stitched over the pocket, shaken hands with homeowners on porches still smelling of fresh lumber, and told people, "We'll make it right," because he meant it. Before that, he had served 12 years in the U.S. Army as a combat engineer, building temporary bridges, clearing blocked roads after floods, and learning that shelter was never just shelter. A roof meant sleep. A door meant dignity. A dry floor meant a person could stand up in the morning and believe life had not completely defeated them. Then Derek Vale, his partner, the man who smiled for clients and handled the money, disappeared behind forged signatures, shell invoices, and missing relief funds. By the time investigators understood Ethan had been used, the damage had already hardened around his name. His company was gone. His house was gone. His bank accounts were frozen, then emptied. The men who once called him sir stopped returning calls. People he had helped looked away in grocery aisles, not cruelly, exactly, but carefully, as if shame could spread by eye contact. Only Atlas stayed close. Atlas, who had once searched flooded neighborhoods with him after hurricanes. Atlas, who knew the difference between danger and grief. Atlas, who now climbed the sagging porch steps first and paused at the door of the $20 cabin, as if listening to something Ethan could not hear. "Not much, is it, boy?" Ethan said, trying to make his voice lighter than his chest felt. The door opened with a long, tired groan. Inside, the single room smelled of mildew, old rain, and wood that had given up years ago. The floorboards bowed under Ethan's weight. Spanish moss brushed the broken window frame like gray fingers. A rusted stove leaned in one corner. A cracked table sat under a ceiling stain shaped almost like a map. Ethan swept his flashlight across the room and let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Home sweet home. Atlas did not move toward the stove or the corners where animals might have nested. He walked straight to the middle of the room and stopped. His ears rose. His body went still, not frightened, not aggressive, simply alert in that old professional way Ethan knew too well. Atlas. The dog lowered his head until his nose hovered inches above one warped plank. Then he lifted one paw and pressed it gently against the floor. Once. Twice, Ethan frowned. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the cypress trees. Inside, beneath the dog's paw, something answered. A faint hollow sound. Metal under wood. Too clean to be rot. Too deep to be chance. Ethan's hand tightened around the flashlight. Atlas looked back at him, amber eyes bright in the dim room. And for the first time in months, Ethan felt something other than exhaustion move through him. Not hope, not yet. Something older, something dangerous and alive. Curiosity. Before Blackwater Bend, before the mud, before the $20 cabin waiting like a dare at the edge of the swamp, Ethan Walker had been the kind of man other men trusted with keys to their homes. That mattered to him more than money ever had. After 12 years in the Army, after bridges assembled in rain and roads reopened under impossible skies, he came home with a toolbox, a service dog, and a stubborn belief that honest work could still hold a man together. He started Walker & Vale Restoration in a rented garage outside Gulfport, Mississippi, with 1 truck, 3 ladders, and Atlas sleeping beneath the office desk like a quiet promise. At first, the jobs were small, patching roofs after summer storms, lifting warped floors, replacing windows that had rattled loose in the wind. Ethan took every call himself. He showed up early, spoke plainly, wrote estimates anyone could understand, and never charged for the small things people were too embarrassed to ask about. A loose railing, a leaking corner, a door that no longer closed right after the house settled. He had seen enough ruined places in his life to know that damage was never just physical. Sometimes a sagging porch made a person feel old. Sometimes a bucket under a ceiling leak made a person feel forgotten. Ethan fixed what he could, and when he could not fix everything, he at least told the truth. Derek Vale came later, polished and smiling, with clean shoes, investor friends, and a voice made for conference rooms. He had known Ethan from a veterans business program in Mobile, and back then Derek seemed like the missing half of the company. Ethan understood wood, concrete, load-bearing walls, and men who hid worry behind jokes. Derek understood contracts, grants, county boards, insurance language, and how to make people with money feel safe. Together they grew fast. Too fast, maybe, though Ethan did not see it then. Within 3 years, Walker & Vale had crews across the Gulf Coast, company shirts, branded trucks, and a reputation for taking on homes other contractors avoided. Ethan still walked job sites with a pencil behind his ear, still knelt to check foundation cracks himself, still let Atlas ride shotgun from one address to the next. There were days he thought he had done it. Not gotten rich, not beaten the past, something better. He had become useful again. Then came the audit. It arrived quietly, not like a storm but like a shadow under a closed door. 1 request for documents became 5, 5 became boxes. Ethan sat in a fluorescent county office while men in pressed shirts slid papers across a table and asked why his signature appeared on invoices he had never seen. Roof repairs billed twice. Materials purchased but never delivered. Relief funds routed through subcontractors Ethan did not recognize. Derek told him not to panic. "It's clerical," he said. "We'll clean it up." 2 days later, Derek was gone. His office was empty except for a coffee mug, a dead plant, and framed photographs turned face down on the desk. The paper trail he left behind was beautiful in the ugliest way. Neat, complete, and pointed almost entirely at Ethan. Months followed in rooms that smelled like old carpet and bad coffee. Lawyers, depositions, frozen accounts, reporters waiting by the courthouse steps. Ethan was never convicted of a crime, but innocence did not hand him back his company. It did not pay the civil claims. It did not stop suppliers from suing or banks from calling. It did not stop former clients from whispering his name like a warning. By the end, he owed $3.8 million and owned almost nothing except a truck with failing brakes, a duffel bag, an Atlas, who watched every stranger with patient suspicion and pressed his head against Ethan's knee on the nights shame sat too heavily in the room. What broke Ethan was not poverty. He had slept in worse places than a truck cab. It was the careful distance in people's eyes. The way they spoke to him as if respect had been repossessed along with the house. He had built roofs for people, and somehow the world had decided he was the kind of man who stole shelter. So when he found Lot 19B online, he did not see a miracle. He saw silence. A place with no neighbors, no questions, no one left to disappoint. He clicked bid with hands that did not tremble until afterward. Atlas lifted his head from the passenger seat and looked at him, and Ethan whispered, "It's just somewhere to land, boy. But some places are not endings. Some places wait." The road to Blackwater Bend did not look like a road so much as a rumor the county had stopped believing in. Ethan followed the GPS until the blue line vanished into a patch of green, then kept going by instinct, tires hissing over cracked asphalt, then gravel, then a narrow strip of clay-colored mud with weeds brushing both doors of the truck. The deeper he drove, the quieter the world became. Cell service disappeared first, then street signs, then mailboxes. Finally, even the tire tracks thinned out, swallowed by standing water and cypress knees pushing up from the earth like old bones. Atlas sat in the passenger seat, steady and watchful, his nose lifted to the slit of air coming through the cracked window. Every few minutes, Ethan glanced at him the way a man checks a compass. "Still with me?" he asked. Atlas blinked once, slow and certain, as if the question was unnecessary. The truck made it another half-mile before the front wheels sank into a soft rut near an abandoned levee. Ethan tried rocking it forward, then back. The engine coughed, the tires spun, and brown water slapped against the undercarriage. He turned the key off before the truck could shame itself further. For a while he just sat there with both hands on the wheel, listening to the ticking engine and the low chorus of insects outside. There had been a time when stuck vehicles were problems he solved for other people. A winch, a board under the tire, a few calm instructions. Now he had no winch, no help coming, and no one to impress with calm. He looked at the auction printout on the dashboard. Lot 19B. Blackwater Bend. Structure present. Access limited. He almost laughed at that. Limited, he murmured. That's one word for it. He should have turned back. A reasonable man would have. But reason had not saved his company, his name, or his home. So Ethan shouldered his duffel, grabbed his toolbox, clipped Atlas's leash to his collar, and walked. The last 2 miles pulled at him like a punishment. Mud sucked at his boots, mosquitoes gathered at his neck, the air smelled of wet leaves, brackish water, and something old turning slowly back into earth. Spanish moss hung from the cypress branches in long gray veils, stirring though there was almost no wind. Every step made the world feel farther away, and for the first time in months, Ethan did not know whether that frightened him or relieved him. Atlas moved ahead, not tugging, just choosing the path with quiet authority. When the dog paused, Ethan paused. When Atlas stepped around a patch of black water, Ethan followed. They crossed a narrow plank bridge so rotten Ethan could feel it bend under his weight. They passed a rusted fuel drum, an overturned crab trap, and the remains of a fence that had forgotten what it was guarding. Then, just as the sun dropped behind a wall of trees and the swamp turned copper dark, the cabin appeared. It sat on stilts above a clearing of mud and sawgrass, leaning slightly to the left, as if exhausted by its own survival. The tin roof was rusted through in places. One shutter hung loose, tapping softly against the wall. The porch sagged in the middle. A vine had climbed up one corner and disappeared under the eaves, stitching the building to the swamp like the swamp was trying to reclaim it kindly, inch by inch. Ethan stopped at the edge of the clearing. For a strange second he felt embarrassed, as though someone had handed him a life too small to fit the man he used to be. Then Atlas stepped forward and placed one paw on the bottom stair. The old wood creaked but held. Ethan followed. On the porch he found a faded blue paint mark near the doorframe, half hidden beneath grime, not a number, not graffiti. More like a surveyor's mark. He brushed it with his thumb and felt a flicker of professional interest he thought had died with his business. Inside, dust floated through the beam of his flashlight. Rain stains spread across the ceiling. The single room was bare except for a cracked table, a rusted stove, and a narrow cot frame with no mattress. It was not much, it was almost nothing, but the deed was in his name. No landlord could raise the rent. No bank officer could tell him to leave by Friday. No neighbor stood across the street deciding whether he deserved pity or suspicion. Ethan set down the duffel and let the silence settle over him. "Well," he said softly, voice rough around the edges, "I guess this is ours." Atlas did not look at him. The dog had already moved to the center of the room, nose low, ears lifted, his entire body listening to the floor. By nightfall, the swamp had stopped pretending to be quiet. The first drops came soft, tapping the tin roof like fingertips, then harder, faster, until the whole cabin seemed to tremble beneath the weight of rain. Ethan found an old lantern hook in the ceiling beam and hung his flashlight from it, letting the narrow cone of light swing across the room. Each time the wind pushed through the broken window, shadows moved where nothing should have moved. Water slipped through 3 places in the roof and gathered in shallow silver pools between the warped boards. Ethan dragged the cot frame away from the worst leak, spread his sleeping bag in the driest corner he could find, and sat down with a tiredness so deep it felt almost peaceful. Outside, thunder rolled over Blackwater Bend, low and patient, as if the sky were clearing its throat before saying something it had kept secret for years. "We've slept in worse," Ethan said, though he was not sure whether he was talking to Atlas or to himself. Atlas stood near the center of the room, his body angled toward one particular patch of floor. He had not eaten much from the dented bowl Ethan set out. He had not settled. Rain glistened along his back where the roof had spat through the ceiling, but he did not shake it off. His ears stayed forward. His nose hovered above the planks. Ethan watched him for a while, the old habit of trusting the dog rising before doubt could stop it. Atlas had found people trapped behind flooded doors. He had sensed weak staircases before Ethan stepped on them. He had once refused to enter a church hall after a hurricane until Ethan discovered the floor joists had split underneath. The dog was not mystical. He was better than that. He paid attention. Ethan pushed himself up and crossed the room, each step testing the boards before giving them his full weight. "What is it?" he murmured. Atlas lifted one paw and pressed it gently against the floor. Tap, then again. Tap. Ethan lowered himself to one knee. The plank beneath Atlas's paw looked no different from the others, maybe darker along one edge, swollen with damp and age. Ethan rapped his knuckles against it. The sound was dull. He shifted 6 inches to the right and knocked again. This time the room answered back with a hollow note that traveled downward instead of across, a clean metallic echo buried under wood, mud, and time. Ethan went still. The storm moved around him. Atlas looked straight into his face, not excited, not afraid, waiting. Ethan's pulse changed. It did not race, it tightened, focused, like a wire pulled straight. For months his mind had been a room full of unpaid bills, court dates, old accusations, and the heavy gray fog of humiliation. But now the part of him that understood structures woke up. He saw the floor not as shelter but as a system. Seams, nails, load points, replaced boards, weight distribution. Someone had cut into this floor once. Someone had covered something. He retrieved the small pry bar from his toolbox, slid it beneath the edge of the dark plank, and leaned carefully. The wood resisted, then sighed upward with a wet crack. Beneath it lay not dirt, not crawl space, not the expected black belly of a swamp cabin, but a flat sheet of rusted steel. Ethan stared at it, rain dripping from his jaw. The steel had been painted once, maybe dark green, though only flakes remained. Mud had sealed its edges. A broken iron ring lay folded into a recess near the center. Atlas lowered his head and breathed against it, then stepped back to give Ethan room. "Who builds a steel hatch under a shack like this?" Ethan whispered. No one answered. The wind pressed against the walls. The shutter outside began tapping again, steady as a nervous finger. Ethan worked the mud from around the ring with his knife. His hands were cold, slick and shaking now, though not from fear alone. Curiosity had a heat of its own. He hooked the pry bar through the ring and pulled. Nothing. He braced one boot against the floor joist, tightened both hands, and pulled again. For a second, the hatch held with the stubbornness of a buried confession. Then the seal broke. Air rushed up from below, stale and mineral cold, carrying the smell of concrete, old metal, and something sealed away from sunlight. Atlas gave one low breath, almost a warning, almost a prayer. Ethan lifted the hatch just enough for the flashlight beam to fall through. Under the cabin, where there should have been mud and rot, a narrow concrete stairway descended into darkness. Ethan did not step down right away. A man learns, after enough years around ruined buildings and unstable ground, that darkness is never empty just because it is quiet. He lay flat on his stomach, one arm braced against the warped floor, and lowered the flashlight through the opening. The beam slid down the concrete steps, revealing walls that should not have existed beneath a $20 swamp cabin. Smooth poured concrete, narrow drainage channels, rust-stained handrails bolted cleanly into the sides. Not perfect, not new, but deliberate. Built by someone who had measured twice, planned ahead, and understood water better than most men understood their own grief. Atlas stood beside the hatch, ears forward, breathing slow. The storm hammered the roof above them, but below, the air seemed untouched by weather, sealed away in a cold pocket of years. Ethan pulled back and sat on his heels. Every reasonable instinct told him to wait until morning. Every tired part of him wanted to close the hatch, crawl into his sleeping bag, and pretend the world had not just opened a mouth beneath his floor. But Atlas lowered one paw onto the first step and looked back. That settled it. Easy, Ethan whispered, though the word was for both of them. He clipped the flashlight to his jacket, took the pry bar in one hand, not as a weapon but as a tool, and started down. The stairs were damp but solid. Each step made a soft, gritty sound under his boots. Behind him, Atlas followed with the careful patience of an old partner who knew when silence mattered. Halfway down, Ethan stopped and ran his fingers across the wall. The concrete was thick, reinforced, the kind of work no weekend handyman could have done. Whoever built this place had spent real money, real time, and real fear. At the bottom, the stairs opened into a low chamber maybe 8 feet wide and 20 feet long. It smelled of minerals, rust, stale air, and old paper sealed too long from daylight. A manual ventilation wheel was mounted near the ceiling. A rusted pipe disappeared upward toward the cabin wall. Along the floor, shallow channels led to a small sump pit, dry now, though the stains told Ethan it had fought water for decades and mostly won. He turned slowly, studying the room with the wary respect he used to give bridges after floods. This was not a storm cellar. A storm cellar needed shelves, blankets, maybe water jugs. This place had conduit lines, anchor bolts, a reinforced ceiling, and at the far end, beneath a sheet of hanging plastic gone brittle with age, a steel door. Ethan moved closer, Atlas did not. The dog stopped 6 feet back, nose low, gaze fixed not on the door itself but on the concrete seam beside it. Ethan noticed it then, faint blue markings on the wall, nearly the same color as the surveyor's mark on the cabin door frame. Numbers, elevation lines, initials half scraped away. Someone had treated this hidden place like a job site. Ethan brushed grime from the steel door. No handle, no keypad, just a circular locking plate, and near the bottom, a small rectangle cut into the wall beside the frame. Atlas stepped forward and pressed his nose to that rectangle. Ethan knelt, dug his knife into the edge, and pried gently. A little metal box slipped loose, clattered once against the floor, and settled between his boots. His breath caught before he could stop it. The box was sealed in waxed canvas and wrapped with a length of brittle electrical tape. Inside lay 3 things: an old brass key, a small notebook sealed in a plastic sleeve, and a folded piece of paper so yellow it looked almost tea-stained. Ethan opened the paper carefully. The handwriting was thin, controlled, unmistakably human in a place that felt designed to erase people. If dignity still matters, open the second door. Ethan read it twice. Above him, rain beat against the cabin. Around him, concrete held its breath. Atlas sat beside him, close enough that Ethan could feel the dog's warmth through his wet jeans. For months, Ethan had believed the world had reduced him to debt, accusation, and a name people no longer respected. But here, under a collapsing shack in a forgotten Louisiana swamp, someone had left a message not about money, not about treasure, not about escape. Dignity. The word moved through him with a strange, quiet force. Ethan looked at the steel door, then at Atlas. "Second door," he murmured. "Which means this is only the first." Atlas blinked, steady and solemn, as if he had known that from the beginning. The notebook did not open like something forgotten. It opened like something that had been waiting. Ethan sat on the concrete floor, with his back against the wall, the flashlight balanced on an overturned cinder block, Atlas lying close enough that his shoulder touched Ethan's knee. Above them, the storm kept working at the cabin, rattling loose tin and dragging rain through the roof seams. But down here the sound arrived softened, distant, like weather heard from inside a memory. The notebook's plastic sleeve had yellowed, but the pages inside were dry. On the first page, written in careful block letters, was a name: Samuel Rook, Civil Surveyor, Mercy Cross Parish Office, 1997-2006. Beneath it, in smaller handwriting, one sentence: "I helped draw the lines that made people disappear." Ethan read it once, then again, feeling the words settle somewhere low in his chest. He had expected numbers, maybe coordinates, maybe instructions for the steel door. He had not expected confession. The early pages were technical: drainage maps, elevation notes, property numbers, old road names, floodplain corrections. Ethan recognized the language immediately. It was the language of land made official: parcels, easements, structures, improvements, loss assessments. Words that sounded clean because they had been scrubbed of human breath. Then 20 pages in, the tone changed. Samuel wrote about storms that came through Mercy Cross in the late 90s and early 2000s. Not the famous ones people made documentaries about, But the smaller disasters that still tore roofs away, soaked insulation, buckled floors, and left families standing in front yards, holding folders of paperwork they did not understand. After each storm, a group of contractors, county officials, tax brokers, and developers moved in with clipboards and sympathetic voices. They promised speed. They promised repair grants. They promised temporary solutions. What they really built, Samuel wrote, was a machine. Fees were added quietly. Notices were mailed to addresses already declared unlivable. Tax liens appeared before insurance checks arrived. Repair contracts carried fine print that transferred rights when payments were delayed. Lots were marked abandoned, though their owners were living with relatives 2 towns over. By the time people returned, their homes had become case numbers. Their porches, kitchens, gardens, and family photographs had been reduced to distressed assets. Ethan's jaw tightened, not with rage exactly, but with recognition. He knew what paper could do when the wrong hands held it. Paper had taken his company. Paper had turned his signature into a trap. Paper had taught strangers to speak his name as if they knew his soul. Atlas lifted his head, sensing the shift in him, and Ethan rested one hand between the dog's ears. "I'm all right," he whispered, though he was not sure it was true. Samuel's entries grew more personal. He described an elderly mechanic named Roy Bell, who lost a shotgun house his father had built after the Korean War. A retired nurse named Elaine Mercer, whose paid-off cottage was reclassified as unsafe, then sold to a restoration company before she could appeal. A lineman named Thomas Greer, a veteran like Ethan, whose property taxes doubled after a clerical correction nobody could explain. No children, no melodrama. Just adults who had worked, paid, repaired, trusted, and then been buried under documents designed to make them feel foolish for objecting. That was the cruelty of it, Ethan realized. Not fists, not threats whispered in dark rooms. Just polished language, missed deadlines, closed offices, and the slow theft of a person's confidence. Samuel had copied everything because guilt had become heavier than fear. He hid duplicate plats, recordings of meetings, lists of shell companies, and original ownership records inside what he called the Mercy Vault. He built it beneath the swamp cabin because the land was worthless on paper, which made it invisible to men who only respected profit. On the last page of the first notebook, Samuel had written, "They stole houses by first stealing the right to be believed. If anyone finds this, do not use it to become powerful. Use it to make people whole." Ethan closed the notebook slowly. In the stale underground air, with rain above and Atlas beside him, he felt the shape of the story changing. This was not treasure, it was not luck, it was responsibility, and responsibility had a weight he knew well. For months, Ethan had come to believe he was a ruined man hiding in a ruined place. But Samuel Rook, dead or gone, or swallowed by whatever silence had followed him, had left behind proof that ruin was sometimes engineered, signed, stamped, and filed. Ethan looked toward the steel door at the end of the chamber. The brass key lay cold in his palm. "We're not the first ones they buried," he said quietly. Atlas stood, walked to the door, and waited. Ethan expected the brass key to open the steel door, and in a way it did. The lock resisted at first, stiff with years of damp air and neglect, then turned with a deep mechanical clunk that traveled through the concrete like a remembered heartbeat. He pulled carefully, expecting darkness, shelves, perhaps more files sealed away in military green boxes. Instead, the door opened into a narrow maintenance alcove no bigger than a closet, lined with rusted conduit, an old breaker panel, and a second wall of concrete that looked at first glance perfectly ordinary. Ethan stared at it for a long moment, feeling disappointment rise before he could name it. After the notebook, after Samuel Rook's careful confession, after that strange sentence about dignity and the second door, he had imagined revelation waiting just beyond the steel. But all he saw was a dead electrical panel, cracked insulation, and water stains shaped like brown fingers reaching down the wall. "Maybe this is it," he said softly. His own voice sounded smaller than he liked. Atlas did not agree. The German shepherd stepped past him into the alcove, lowered his head, and began tracing the base of the back wall with his nose. Slow, certain, not sniffing at random, not searching for food or rodents, but working the room the way he used to work collapsed houses after hurricanes. Ethan felt the old patience return to him. He knew that focus. He had learned years ago not to interrupt it. Atlas stopped near the right corner, lifted one paw, and pressed it against a square of concrete that looked no different from the rest. Then he leaned his ear close to it. Ethan frowned and crouched beside him. The wall had been skim-coated. Good work, but not perfect. Near the floor, beneath a veil of mineral dust, he could see a hairline seam, too straight to be a crack. He brushed it with his thumb. The outer layer flaked away, revealing a thin vertical cut. His pulse tightened again. "All right," he whispered. "You were right." Atlas gave him a look that carried no pride, only expectation. Ethan studied the breaker panel next. Most of the switches were dead, their labels faded into meaningless smudges, but one plate sat slightly crooked. He removed 2 screws with his multi-tool and eased the panel forward. Behind it, tucked into the concrete, was a circular brass dial no larger than a jar lid, green with age around the edges. No numbers were visible until he wiped it with his sleeve. 4 wheels, a mechanical code. Ethan closed his eyes for half a second. Samuel had not made this easy, but he had not made it impossible either. The answer had to be in the notebook. He went back through the pages, turning them with care, searching not for facts now but for the way a guilty man might hide a key inside a memory. Near the middle, beside a flood map of Mercy Cross, Samuel had written, "The water took the courthouse steps in 2005, and that was the year I stopped," pretending maps were neutral. Ethan stared at the line. 2005, he murmured. He set the wheels to 205. Nothing happened. For a second, the disappointment returned, sharper this time. Then Atlas nudged his wrist with his nose, gentle but firm. Ethan looked again. The dial required 4 positions, yes, but the first wheel had not fully seated. He turned it back, then forward until it clicked cleanly into place. A hidden latch released inside the wall with a soft, heavy sound, like a sigh from someone who had been holding their breath for 20 years. The concrete panel shifted outward half an inch. Ethan pulled it open. Cold, dry air moved across his face. Beyond the second door was a smaller room, better sealed than the first, its walls lined with metal shelves and waterproof storage cases stacked in careful rows. No gold, no jewels, no movie version treasure, just boxes labeled with names, parcel numbers, dates, storm codes, and streets that probably no longer existed except in the minds of people who had once called them home. On a metal table in the center sat an old hard drive wrapped in layers of plastic, 3 microcassette recorders, several envelopes of photographs, and a wooden sign darkened by age. Ethan lifted the sign and read the words carved into it. "A house is not property first, it is memory first." Something in him gave way then, quietly, without drama. He thought of the house he had lost. Not the square footage, not the mortgage, not the resale value. He thought of coffee at dawn before job sites, Atlas sleeping near the back door, rain against a roof he had repaired with his own hands. He thought of how easily the world called a home an asset when it wanted to take it. Atlas sat beside the table, calm and watchful. Ethan placed one hand on the dog's head and looked at the rows of stolen names. "Okay, boy," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Let's find out who they tried to erase." Ethan spent the rest of the night inside the Mercy Vault, with Atlas at his feet and other people's lives spread across the metal table in front of him. The storm above Blackwater Bend weakened toward dawn, but underground time had no weather. It had paper, dust, and names. He opened one waterproof case, then another, careful not to disturb more than he could put back. Deeds, survey maps, tax notices, repair contracts. Photographs of porches before they were torn down. Kitchens with coffee mugs still on counters. Gardens marked in red pencil as future access corridor. Each file carried the same quiet wound. A person had lived somewhere, trusted someone, signed something, missed a deadline they never knew existed, and then a house became a number. Ethan found himself reading the names aloud, not loudly, not ceremonially, just enough for the room to stop feeling like storage and start feeling like witness. Roy Bell, Elaine Mercer, Thomas Greer, Loretta Hayes, Martin Pike, Janice Whitlow. Atlas listened as if every name mattered. By sunrise, Ethan understood 2 things. First, he could not carry this alone. Second, if he chose the wrong person, Samuel Rook's secret would disappear all over again. And maybe this time no dog, no storm, no ruined veteran would ever find it. His first thought was the police, but paper crimes had a way of looking harmless in the wrong office. His second thought was a lawyer, but he could barely afford canned food. Then, inside a folder labeled Press Contacts, Do not send unless necessary. He found an old newspaper clipping by Mara Whitcomb, investigative reporter, New Orleans Sentinel. The article was about coastal land transfers after hurricanes, written with the kind of restraint that made each sentence feel sharpened rather than loud. At the bottom, Samuel had circled one line in blue ink. People do not lose homes only to water. Sometimes they lose them to signatures. Ethan folded the clipping and put it in his jacket. 3 hours later, after hiking back to the truck, freeing it with boards and patience, and driving until his phone found one trembling bar of service, he called the number he found online. Mara did not answer with warmth. "This is Whitcomb." Ethan almost hung up. He heard traffic on her end, a coffee shop maybe, voices, normal life continuing somewhere beyond the swamp. "My name is Ethan Walker," he said. Silence. Not empty silence. Recognizing silence. "Walker and Vale Restoration?" she asked. There it was again. The old stain moving through a stranger's voice. Ethan closed his eyes. "Yes, I know the case." "Then you know what they said I did. I know what was printed." That answer, careful and honest, kept him on the line. He told her only enough. Blackwater Bend, Samuel Rook, Mercy Vault, land records, old storm claims. He did not mention the second door until she stopped interrupting. When he finished, Mara said nothing for so long Ethan could hear Atlas breathing beside him. Finally, she said, "That story sounds impossible. Most true things do until somebody proves them." She gave a short, humorless breath. "Send me one document." "No. Then why call me?" Ethan looked through the windshield at the swamp road ahead, at sunlight catching in the puddles like broken glass. "Because Samuel Rook trusted you before I knew your name. And because if I send one document, it becomes a loose page. I need someone to see the room." Mara arrived the next afternoon in a mud-splattered Subaru, wearing jeans, boots, and an expression built from skepticism and old disappointment. She was 39, with dark hair pinned messily at the back of her head and eyes that seemed to read exits before faces. She studied Ethan first, then Atlas, then the leaning cabin. "You live here?" "I landed here," Ethan said. "Not the same thing." For the first time, something in her face softened. Not pity. Recognition. Atlas approached her calmly, sniffed her hand, then turned and walked toward the open hatch. Mara watched him descend into the floor and whispered, "Well, that's unsettling." But she followed. In the vault, skepticism left her slowly, file by file, photograph by photograph, name by name. By the time Ethan showed her the wooden sign, Mara had one hand over her mouth and the other pressed flat against the table, as if the room had tilted. "This isn't just old corruption," she said. "Some of these shell companies are still active." Ethan felt the words before he understood them. Mara opened another folder, then another. Her face changed. "Derek Vale's name isn't here," she said. "But his companies are." The room seemed to grow smaller. Atlas leaned against Ethan's leg, grounding him. Mara looked up and her voice lowered. "Mr. Walker, I don't think you found a secret from the past. I think you found the root system of what happened to you." Ethan stared at the boxes, at the names, at the proof, breathing quietly under mud and rain. For months he had wanted his own name cleared. Now, surrounded by stolen homes and buried dignity, that wish felt too small to hold the whole truth. By the third day, the swamp no longer felt empty. It felt watched, though no one stood among the cypress trees, and no headlights cut through the levee road after dark. The pressure arrived the way civilized pressure always did. Folded, stamped, polite, and signed by people who never had mud on their shoes. Mara found the first notice nailed to the cabin door just after sunrise, sealed in a plastic sleeve to keep the rain from softening its authority. Lot 19B had been flagged for environmental review. The structure was deemed unsafe. The county recommended immediate vacancy pending inspection. Ethan read it twice, then passed it to Mara without a word. She scanned the letter, her mouth tightening at one corner. That was fast. Atlas stood beside the porch steps, staring toward the tree line, not alarmed, simply alert. Ethan knew that posture. It was the same stillness Atlas carried before a ceiling gave way or a road washed out. Something unseen had shifted. By noon, Mara's phone was ringing with numbers she did not answer. By 2, a local business blog had posted a story calling Ethan a disgraced contractor hiding in a swamp and chasing conspiracy theories to repair his reputation. By evening, the article had been shared by 3 county officials, 2 real estate accounts, and a smiling developer named Harlan Voss, whose company logo Mara had already found buried in half a dozen Mercy Vault files. Harlan Voss was not the kind of man people pictured when they imagined harm. He wore soft blue suits, donated to historic preservation committees, funded veterans' breakfasts, and spoke in careful phrases about renewal, resilience, and bringing forgotten communities back to life. In photographs, he always stood slightly turned toward whoever needed him most. But in Samuel Rook's files, Voss Legacy Group appeared again and again like mold behind fresh paint, acquiring distressed parcels, funding tax brokers, partnering with shell contractors that shared addresses with companies Derek Vale once used. No one had to shout when they owned the letterhead. No one had to threaten when a legal envelope could do the trembling for them. That night, Ethan sat at the cracked table above the vault while Mara spread documents into quiet piles. Atlas lay near the hatch, his body between the hidden stairs and the door. The cabin smelled of damp wood, old paper, and coffee boiled too long on a camp stove. Ethan had not slept more than 2 hours at a time since Mara arrived. Shame was back too, wearing a new mask. Not the old shame of being accused, but the raw fear of being publicly doubted again. "They're going to make this about me," he said. Mara did not look up from the file she was reading. "They already have, and people will believe it. Some will." Her honesty landed hard, but not cruelly. Ethan rubbed both hands over his face. "I spent a year trying to prove I wasn't what Derek made me look like. It didn't matter. Once people have a story that lets them stop thinking, they keep it." Mara finally looked at him. Her eyes were tired but steady. "Then give them a better story. Not louder, better." Before Ethan could answer, his phone buzzed, unknown number. He let it ring once, twice, then answered. Derek Vale's voice came through warm as old varnish. "Ethan, I heard you found yourself some swamp history." Ethan closed his eyes. Across the room, Atlas lifted his head. "Don't call again," Ethan said. "You always were bad at knowing when a door was closing," Derek replied. No anger, no panic, just that same smooth confidence that once made investors lean forward. "Whatever you think you found, it won't fix what people think of you." Ethan looked down at Samuel Rook's notebook lying open beside his hand. Dignity, memory, names. "Maybe this isn't about what they think of me." A pause, small but real. "Careful," Derek said softly. "Martyrs don't get their houses back." The line went dead. Ethan set the phone down gently, as if sudden movement might crack something inside him. For a long moment, rain whispered through the roof seams. Then Atlas stood, walked to Ethan, and rested his head against his thigh, not demanding. Not comforting like a pet, anchoring like a partner. Ethan placed his hand on the dog's neck and felt the slow, living warmth beneath the fur. He thought of every person in those files who had been made to feel foolish, careless, unworthy of being believed. He thought of how easily respect could be taken when a room full of important people decided someone did not deserve it. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it no longer shook. "We don't answer their story with mine," he said. "We answer it with everyone's." Mara nodded once and reached for another folder. Outside, the swamp pressed close. Inside, under a ruined roof, the truth began arranging itself for daylight. The first person to arrive at the old Mercy Cross Chapel was not a reporter or a lawyer. It was Roy Bell, 81 years old, wearing a brown work jacket shiny at the elbows, and holding a folded property photograph in both hands, like it might vanish if he loosened his grip. He stepped through the chapel doors at 9 in the morning, looked at Ethan, then at the rows of file boxes stacked beside the pulpit, and said, "I was told my place never really belonged to me." Ethan did not know what to say to that. There were sentences too small for certain wounds. So he simply pulled out a chair. "Then let's look at the papers together." By 10, the chapel was full. Not crowded with spectacle, not loud with outrage, but full of adults who had carried private doubts for years. Retired roofers, nurses, dock workers, mechanics, widows, veterans. People who had signed forms at folding tables after storms, trusted officials behind desks and gone home believing the confusion was their fault. Mara stood near the side wall with 2 cameras recording, not for drama, but for record. Julian Price, a community attorney with silver hair and a voice calm enough to lower the temperature of a room, had already sent encrypted copies of the Mercy Vault files to state investigators, federal housing officials, and 3 national newspapers. "Today is not revenge," Julian told the room. "Today is documentation." Ethan stood behind the pulpit with Atlas seated at his left side. He had faced rooms before: army briefings, county boards, angry homeowners, court hearings where every word felt like a trap. But this room was different. No one here wanted him to perform. They wanted to know whether the ache they had lived with had a name. He opened Samuel Rook's notebook and read only one line. They stole houses by first stealing the right to be believed. A hush moved through the chapel, not silence exactly, but recognition. Then Mara began calling names. One by one, people came forward. Roy Bell saw the original deed his father had signed in 1954. Elaine Mercer saw the appeal letter she had mailed, but had been marked undeliverable to an address she had never used. Thomas Greer found the tax correction that doubled his bill after a storm had already made his home unlivable. No one shouted. Somehow that made it heavier. A few people pressed hands to their mouths. A few sat very still, eyes fixed on documents that returned not money, not yet, but something nearly as precious. The knowledge that they had not imagined the wrong done to them. Near noon, Harlan Voss appeared at the back of the chapel with 2 attorneys and a smile polished thin. He did not raise his voice. He spoke of incomplete context, legacy processes, unfortunate clerical confusion. Ethan listened until the words began doing what words like that always did, smoothing sharp edges until people could no longer feel where they had been cut. Then Atlas stood. The dog did not bark. He simply rose beside Ethan and faced the room, steady, old, and unafraid. Ethan rested one hand on Atlas's head and spoke quietly. A house is not just an asset. It is where a man drinks coffee before work. It is where a woman keeps her mother's recipes. It is where muddy boots wait by the door, and rain sounds safe because the roof holds. When you take that from someone with paperwork, and then make them feel foolish for asking why, you take more than property. You take dignity. And dignity does not expire because a file was closed. For the first time, Harlan's smile failed. Not dramatically, just enough. By evening, the story had left Mercy Cross. By the next week, investigations opened. Not every wrong was repaired quickly. Some records were too old. Some companies had dissolved into other names. Ethan's own debt did not disappear overnight. Life rarely gave back what it took in one clean motion. But claims were reopened, titles were reviewed. Reporters stopped using the word disgraced without caution. And for the first time in a long while, when Ethan Walker walked into town with Atlas at his side, people met his eyes. Months later, the cabin at Blackwater Bend still leaned, but it no longer felt abandoned. Ethan repaired the roof first, then the porch, then the floor above the hatch. He did not turn it into a museum. He called it the Atlas House, a small archive for land records, storm histories, and the names Samuel Rook had refused to let vanish. On clear evenings, Ethan sat on the porch while Atlas slept near his boots, the swamp breathing softly around them. He had bought the cabin because he had nowhere left to go. But Atlas had heard what no one else could. Not just metal under the floor, but truth still breathing beneath all that mud. If this story reminded you that a home is more than walls and a roof, take a second to like, subscribe, and tell us which moments stayed with you most. And I'd love to know where you're watching from, so drop your city or state in the comments.